Welcome everybody, hello. This next session, I'll try and keep us on time for lunch because I appreciate I stand between us and lunch. So less of a fireside chat, more of a fire hose of information from a MiFID II perspective. It's worth probably touching on, and again I'll apologise in advance if I run through these slides at a pace. What is the Market in Financial Instruments Directive 2 all about? Who does it affect? Why does it affect organisations here in Asia? It's worth putting it in context that it is, of course, the European response to the G20 coming out of Pittsburgh, I think sometime late September 2008, 2009, something like that. We had directive from the G20 to increase the clarity, the transparency around the OTC markets. And MiFID II is the response of the European Union to that G20 initiative. So it's not something that's been generated in isolation per se within Europe in and of itself. It's very much part of a global response around the G20. Who does it affect directly? We get into the concepts of the EEA, the European Economic Area, which is still 27 member states of the European Union, along with Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. So those are the areas, they're the constituents that make up the European Economic Area. So MiFID directly affects those, but it's also fair to say that it will indirectly affect many organisations who sit outside of that economic area, particularly organisations in Asia who trade in Europe, trade with European counterparties, trade with European clients. And that's really what today is about. How is MiFID going to affect Asian clients? First thing I normally do with any MiFID fireside chat, fire hose of information I get into, is I run through some of the acronyms. I often say when I talk about MiFID, it's the opportunity to construct an entire sentence without a verb or a noun anywhere in it. Something along the lines of the SI talks to the APA or the ARM and the ARM to the NCA and so on. You can just throw acronym after acronym at whoever you're talking to. But it's worth just touching on some of these more common terms. I'm going to hop down to the trading venues. Some of these you'll be familiar with, the regulated markets, the exchanges, from a European perspective, things like the London Stock Exchange, Deutsche Börse, Paris Börse, and so on. They are now called RMs, regulated markets. We also have MTFs, multilateral trading facilities. They existed since 2007 when MiFID was implemented. So we have the lines of BATS, Chi-X, and so on there, MTFs in an equities world that we're perhaps more familiar with. We're now beginning MTFs in a non-equity asset class environment under MiFID II. Then we start getting into some of the newer definitions, the organised trading facility. In old money, what we would have called perhaps the IDBs, the interdealer brokers, so the ICAPs, the Tullets, Nexes, Tradition, those organisations now become OTF. So if you dealt in the OTC markets via an interdealer broker, that interdealer broker now becomes designated an OTF, and they become a venue, and they will have to pre- and post-trade publish that information, as well as potentially undertake transaction reporting for non-EEA entities. You add into that systematic internalisation. That scope has been broadened under MiFID II. Definition from a systematic internaliser perspective, anyone who is trading frequently, systemically, substantively on their own book in a particular instrument, that organisation will be deemed a systematic internaliser. They get treated as a venue. They too will have to pre- and post-trade up to the market. They publish that information typically out through an APA, the top definition there, an approved publication arrangement. That's a mechanism by which that data gets out to the marketplace. Other areas that we touch on, best execution, that's been enhanced under MiFID II. So under MiFID, it was all reasonable steps. Under MiFID II, it's all sufficient steps have to be demonstrated that the order was executed with the best interests of the client at heart. So that all sufficient steps is universally thought of as raising the bar to an absolute standard. All reasonable steps were taken as a relative view in the marketplace, dependent perhaps on size, maturity of an organisation. All sufficient steps, very much an absolute, this is what needs to be done to prove best execution. Best execution needs to be proven at two levels, once at the venue level, quality of execution, as well as then at the investment firm level, against their client interactions. And then some other areas that we should touch on: ARMS, approved reporting mechanisms. That's the mechanism through which transaction reporting takes place. And you'll hear trade reporting, you'll hear transaction reporting. Those are fundamentally different. Trade reporting up to the marketplace public doesn't include the LEI. Transaction reporting up to the local competent authority, the national regulator, that does include corporate and LEI information. The other area that we should touch on is that of particularly significant to Asia, non-European entities, jurisdictions, is that of the third country firm and equivalents. So when we talk about an investment firm in MiFID, investment firm is a European definition. It applies to organizations who are registered within that European economic area. If you were to carry on similar investment services, advisory services, but you're registered outside of Europe, then you come under the classification as a third country firm, and then you have the ability to establish a branch or establish a subsidiary within Europe, or potentially even trade in Europe without establishing a branch structure. And there are various rules and regulations as to whether that's the exclusive initiative of the client asking you to undertake some form of transaction on their behalf, then you don't necessarily have to register as a branch, or it's down to the local jurisdiction. One thing I get into, I didn't perhaps touch on it much on the previous slide, and I often say this, there's a difference between MiFID and MiFIA. And when I've said MiFIA, people think it's sort of a pun on the word fear, as in F-E-A-R, as in something to be frightened of. But MiFIA is the regulation, the Markets in Financial Instruments regulation. Transaction reporting, for example, falls under the MiFIA obligations, and the regulations are implemented European-wide. They're consistent across all of the 27 countries and the 3 additional EEA countries. MiFID, the directive, is transposed into local law by each one of those local regulators. So there's an opportunity for each of the regulator to put their flavour on the directive if they wish. And the establishment of a branch, for example, is one of those areas where the local regulator has determined or can determine what they would like to do. In the UK, under Article 39, which is the specific article in the MiFID directive, then it's whether you need to establish a branch to undertake those investment services or not. The UK has decided you don't have to establish a branch structure. Other regulators, the AMF in France, BaFin in Germany, for example, may insist that you do establish a branch structure to undertake those investment services. So there are nuances potentially at the country-by-country level, at the directive level. And then we get to the term equivalence, and that's where the European Commission has recognized that an organization coming in from an outside jurisdiction, a third country firm, that their home regulator is deemed equivalent in terms of its prudential oversight and so on to the establishment of a branch within the EU. There is phasing around that equivalence. There's a sort of a phase 1, which will be ready, luckily, for January next year. As a reminder, MiFID II is implemented 3rd of January next year, so the European Commission have said there is a phase 1 equivalence around certain jurisdictions. They're targeting the likes of Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, North America, and so on, the major markets. Then there is a second phase of equivalence post-January. They've not actually said what's going to happen, other than I suspect you'll fall under the obligations of your local jurisdiction. That's normally what happens if equivalence is pending. You fall under the realms of whichever country you perhaps have established your branch in. Now, I'm going to speed up because the clock down there is telling me I've got 5 minutes, so the fire hose, I'm afraid, is upping in pace. What's the impact? I'm just going to concentrate on the far right-hand side, and specifically that non-EU buy side. There'll be much more market data available. If you trade in European markets, we're onboarding something like 35 new venues onto the Thomson Reuters platform in terms of our real-time data provision. So as Brendan touched on there, the increased use of analytics is something that we see perhaps being important to buy side outside of the European Union, inside as well for that matter, but predominantly outside, talking to a lot of organizations in Asia about their best use of TCA platforms and so on. One thing I should touch on, though, is the LEI. That's something I hear a lot of. I was at a conference in Singapore. We had a speaker from one of the major consultancy companies, something like 500,000 LEIs created to date, 10,000 of which have been issued in Asia. So Asia is definitely delinquent, if I can use that word, in terms of the number of LEIs in the marketplace. And if you don't have an LEI as of 3rd of January, you don't really get into Europe as a way to trade. So certainly organizations that I've been speaking to here and in Singapore is very much how do they create an awareness that LEI codes will be needed, both for themselves and their clients. Other things that we'll touch on, things like the trading obligation, which are consistent and uniform, irrespective of whether you're in Europe or not. And what I mean by that is this is a slide I use a lot with organizations outside of Europe. Look at where the entity that you're thinking about is domiciled. So if you're an organization, where do you have a domiciled entity? If it's in the EEA, then you sweep up the top of the diagram. You have to determine specifically whether you're a venue or a pseudo venue. So are you a systematic internalizer? If the answer is yes, then you see all of the MiFID II obligations on the right-hand side of the diagram. Pre-post-trade transparency, best execution in terms of quality of reporting, transaction reporting, reference data reporting up to the FIRDS, which is the ESMA reference database, which needs to take place daily so it can calculate and recalibrate market volumes, as well as the other obligations as we go down. If you're just an investment firm, perhaps if you have a subsidiary within Europe, then you don't need to do the pre-trade publication or the venue best execution reporting, but you most certainly do have to do post-trade reporting. You'll have to demonstrate best execution to your clients. You'll have to do transaction reporting up to the national competent authority. Even if you're not domiciled in the EEA and you are a financial counterparty or a non-financial counterparty plus, things such as the trading obligation, whether an instrument has been trading on a trading venue. What that basically means is if an instrument is traded on one of those regulated markets or venues, SIs, it has to stay traded on a trading venue. It can't then be done OTC. So you will be impacted by things such as trading obligations, ETD, indirect clearing, commodity, derivative position limits. All of those apply at an entity level rather than only apply to European organizations. So in terms of understanding the impact, what is the effect that MiFID is going to have? We talked to a number of organizations. They tend to be in four areas of maturity. First area is that of understanding and impact. What is this thing all about and how does it affect my organization? Second phase is that of operationalization. MiFID is too fundamental to actually just sort of throw a couple of graduates and a spreadsheet out once a quarter. People have to actually institutionalize it into their business as usual. So how do you operationalize it? Third phase is that of solution selection. There's a bit more maturity. They're looking at how they can actually solve the MiFID II problems. The fourth phase, I'm yet to meet anyone at the fourth phase, implementation phase. So most organizations that I talk to are in phases 1 through 3. Most actually are in 1 to 2, still, in Europe and outside of Europe. So looking at how it affects you as an organization, understanding whether you can adopt certain new technologies, certainly even within the directive, even within the text, ESMA supports the use of new technologies to enhance and to provide some of the MiFID II capabilities, and narrowing down and eliminating some of the ambiguities. One of which I should point out here, some of the indirect requirements with regards to natural name information. So if you have a subsidiary in Europe, and that is transaction reporting up to the national regulator, under MiFID II, something like 65 or so transaction fields, natural name is part of that. So to give you an idea as to where those 65 fields come from, we've got things like market identification codes, MIC codes, LEIs, CFIs, but also investment decision maker and buyer-seller information. So understanding the impact on you and your client base, or understanding the impact on you and your relationship with what's reported in Europe is something that you may want to consider. If this were the Oscars, the music would be playing and I'd be having to get off. Luckily, it's not the Oscars, and I've got a couple more minutes just to run through. So business model implications, standardize where necessary, industrialize. I touched on that second phase of operationalization. That's something organizations definitely have to do where MiFID is concerned. Outsource. What is there that you can do that others can do for you? We as a provider provide an extensive range of MiFID II capability. I often describe internally MiFID II as white light, and that it's sort of red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, violet, blue, all of those. And you can be talking research, you can be talking transaction reporting, trade reporting, you can be talking each of the individual colors, but at some point it all comes together as white light. So from a TR perspective, we do offer a very holistic set of MiFID II solutions. But also, what else can you be doing to perhaps mitigate the impacts of MiFID? You can't avoid it per se, but perhaps you can mitigate. Trade on venue, trade with organizations who are trading on venue, let the venue take care of some of that reporting for you, rather than the obligation falling on you. Bear in mind that from a MiFID perspective, the obligation is on the venue or the seller of a particular instrument. I touched on our holistic solution. I normally put this up because I was always taught never to put more than 3 items on a slide. And I just do that just to remind myself that I remember I was taught never to put more than 3 items on a slide. I put this up really, though, to show how extensive the Thomson Reuters solution set is from a MiFID II perspective, and how extensive MiFID is as an issue or as a challenge that we're all, as an industry, addressing. This is what I mean by you can't throw a couple of graduates and a spreadsheet at it. It's not something that you can just do once a quarter. It's actually embedded in your operational activities. So from our perspective, all of those aspects are covered in terms of enhancements and improvements, if I can put it that way, to our systems to support MiFID II. And then finally, the previous slide sets up that comment, scope is massive. That's something I hear time and time and time again. So start as soon as possible. If you don't think, or if you're not sure MiFID applies to you, I would ask you to check. It has a great reach, if you like. The ripples of that particular pebble are reaching many a distant shore from a MiFID perspective. So get on it quickly, move forward, get senior management's buy-in, get their support, get peer review. That's something I've found very important. I touched on this ambiguity. One organization I spoke to had 3 conflicting legal opinions in 3 months as to whether they were or weren't captured from a MiFID II perspective. So a lot of organizations I know are benefiting from actual peer discussions and understanding where the industry is taking a position rather than specifically getting pure independent legal advice on specific issues. So understand from your peer group what the implications of MiFID II are. Now, I've overrun by 3 minutes, 40 seconds, so my apologies for that. So I did stand between yourselves and lunch, but hopefully I appreciate that was a real run through of MiFID and the implications on the buy side in Asia. But at that stage, I shall let you get to your sandwiches and refreshments.